Welcome to the Planetary Republic of Comics. This is Module 4, where we'll be talking about gender and sexuality in comics. I am Professor Frederick Luis Aldama, here at The Ohio State University. Women, gay, lesbian, and transgender peoples have long suffered at the hands of male exploiters and oppressors. While the degree of exploitation and oppression differs in time and place, this has been and remains one of the central destructive forces ripping our social tissue apart. Comic book narratives have both uncritically reproduced and critically resisted and critiqued this reality. Until relatively recently, comic book creators have not only been dominated by male creators, but also creators who choose not to create story worlds that upset heteronormative conventions. They choose to create story worlds that either erased completely the presence of women, gay, lesbian, and transgender peoples that make up the world, or to do so in ways that upheld a patriarchal, straight male status quo. Indeed, even when those creators arrived that chose to push the envelope of comic book narrative convention, they often made vital and new one aspect of identity by either neglecting or denigrating women and non-normative sexual others. For instance, in the US, when Robert Crumb and others ushered in a radical new comics mode of recreating the world, while they threw open the doors to a straight, largely male sexual liberation, they often did so by denigrating women as well as sexual and racial others. This isn't to say that comic book narratives have not been an important place for the radical exploration of feminist and queer identities. For instance, in the US, during the time of the male-centric underground comics revolution, women artists, authors, editors appeared on the scene to create and publish stories that affirmed the female and queer self in ways that promoted greater gender and queer equality. After Trina Robbins moved to San Francisco to join the underground comics scene, she discovered not only that publishing venues for comics excluding women, but that many of her male contemporaries were uncensoring themselves by exploring misogynist and racist fantasies in their comics, as Jared Gardner states. The result, a flurry of creation by women authors. 2 years after the publication of the first all-woman comic book, It Ain't Me, Babe, in 1970, Sharon Rudall, Terry Richards, Lee Mars, Pat Mudian, Aline Kaminsky, and Trina Robbins published the first ongoing comic drawn exclusively by women, Women's Comics, from 1972 that ran to 1992. Later, the group would splinter, with Kaminsky and Diane Newman creating the one-shot Twisted Sisters in 1976 that featured on its cover Kaminsky's autobiographical character, The Bunch, sitting defecating on a toilet. Many other feminist-oriented comic books appeared during this period, including Joyce Farmer and Lynn Chiavelli's Tits and Clits, that also affirmed women's sexuality. These women creators chose to sidestep those self-centered and macho-driven stories seen in the work of Crumb, Gilbert Shelton, Spain Rodriguez, and other underground comics creators. They also chose to create an aesthetic that stood in sharp contrast. For instance, Trina Robbins chooses the slick brush line to create Panthea in 1976, a line style that was uncommon in the male underground comic scene. Indeed, as scholar Hilary Shute identifies how such women creators during this period, such as Robbins and Linda Berry, used the visual shaping devices to inscribe themselves on the page as, quote, legible, visual drawn bodies that embodied at once the individual as well as the collective experience. For instance, Shute identifies Aline Kaminsky's choice to use handwriting in her work as more than just a means of conveying information. It was her way of powerfully inscribing herself as a woman in time and place. It affirmed the female self without disclosing the self. In the hands of a woman creator like Kaminsky, a shaping device like the handwritten lettering could serve, according to Hilary Shute, as a tool to carve, quote, out space for the representation of complex lived realities, end quote. In response to the straight underground scene and its deplorable depictions of women and LGBTQ characters, there was the incipient rise of a queer comic book scene. Several gay and lesbian creators created comics that explored queer sexuality with greater sophistication and complexity. For instance, there was Mary Wings, who published her one-shot lesbian comic, Come Out Comics, followed by Dyke Shorts. And there appeared Roberta Gregory, who published the first lesbian underground serial comic, Dynamite Damsels, in 1976. And in the 1980s, we see the arrival on the scene of a publishing venue for gay, lesbian, and transsexual artists with gay comics, as well as Meat Men comics. And the pioneering G.B. Jones arrives on the scene with her punk lesbian aesthetic. After the publication of her queer zine, J.D., in 1985, she went on to trouble more radically what she considered too restrictive feminist and LGBTQ notions of sexuality and agency with her comic Double Bill. Inspired by what was going on in the US with the comic scene, we see in the mid-1980s in France several women creators such as Florence Kestac, Nicole Clavelou, Jean Pouchol, and Chantal Montellier began publishing feminist bande dessinée. In January 1985, many of these women creators published a manifesto published in Le Monde that condemned the male chauvinist macho fantasies that had typified bande dessinée. Their feminist affirming comics helped usher in a new era of French comics known as La Nouvelle Bande Dessinée that appeared and appealed to readers that had historically been otherwise sidelined or denigrated in comics. With the founding of the independent comic book publisher L'Association in 1990, these efforts in France became solidified. Arguably one of the best known of these comics to be published by the artist-created cooperative publishing house known as L'Association was Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. Not only did the comic book format offer Satrapi a venue to critique repressive Islamic State, but also to reconstruct the self of a girl, then woman, coming of age within the socio-political trauma of the Islamic Revolution and capitalist imperialism. In Latin America, we have women comic book creators also troubling the representational map. In the early 1980s, Patricia Brescia, the daughter of Argentine's most famous comic book authors, Alberto Brescia, publishes her feminist strip Sol de Noche. Here and elsewhere, Brescia portrays in gritty, harsh detail the difficulties that independent, strong-willed female characters face in Buenos Aires, suffocating with military tyranny and a macho hegemony. The manga scene in Japan also experienced a transformation. Against the kind of stereotypical representations of women in seinen komiku, or adult comics, girls and women with large round eyes, elongated eyelashes, long noses, thin lips, large breasts, small waistlines, that reinforced male superiority. We had the arrival of women mangaka that created shoujo manga, focused stories on female relationships as well as gender-bending moments. And there arrives on the publishing scene the yaoi manga, those identified as boy-boy stories for adult readers. In these boy-boy romance comics, we see young men, teens, experiencing the kind of emotional insecurities normally only fixed to girl women in more traditional manga. Comic book creators work under different socio-historical and political circumstances. For instance, because of the histories of cultural censorship in other countries, feminist or queer-themed comics appear at different moments. It is not until the death of Franco in 1975, for instance, that we see the publication of queer comics in Spain. In Manuel, the creator Rodrigo Muñoz Ballester uses visuals to queer, otherwise straight urban spaces of Madrid as readers follow the gay protagonist's journey through the city. And we don't see a feminist comic tradition in places like the Middle East and India until very recently. It is only in a post-Mubarak Egypt that venues such as the satiric magazine Tok Tok appear to give voice to those at the social margins, women, children, and those of non-dominant races and classes. While comics creation around the world has been characterized by heteronormative expression and histories of censorship, comic books have been an important narrative space for the radical exploration of feminist and LGBTQ identities.